When widowed rancher Margaret Caldwell hires drifter Daniel McKenna to help save her Dakota Territory ranch in 1887, she never expects him to also save her heart from 3 years of crushing grief. But when her late husband's brother arrives with forged papers and hired guns, threatening to steal everything she's built, Margaret must choose between the safety of surrender and the courage to fight for a love she thought was lost forever. Can a woman who believed her heart died with her husband discover that some flowers truly do bloom twice? The sound of breaking china shattered the morning silence like a gunshot. Margaret Caldwell stared down at the pieces of her favorite cup scattered across the kitchen floor, the coffee spreading in a dark puddle that looked too much like blood. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 years. 3 long years since James died, and she still reached for 2 cups every morning, still set 2 plates at the table, still talked to empty air like he might answer back. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly beyond her window, golden grass dancing in the October wind of 1887. Once, this land had felt like paradise. Now it felt like a prison with no walls and no way out. Margaret knelt to pick up the broken pieces, careful not to cut herself. Blood was the last thing she needed today. The bankman was coming this afternoon, and she already knew what he would say. The same thing everyone said. A woman alone can't run a ranch. Time to sell. Time to move to town. Time to give up. But this ranch was all she had left of James. Every fence post they had driven together. Every acre they had cleared side by side. Every dream they had planted in this stubborn soil. A meadowlark sang from the fence outside, its voice clear and sweet. James used to say meadowlarks were good luck. Margaret wondered if he still believed that. Wherever he was now, she swept up the broken china and dumped it in the trash bucket. Another piece of her old life gone forever. The kitchen felt bigger somehow, emptier, like the walls were moving away from her. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove. She had forgotten to light the fire again. These days, she forgot a lot of things. Important things. Like eating, like sleeping, like reasons to keep going. Outside, her cattle dotted the hillside like brown and white specks. 40 head of beef cattle and 12 dairy cows. Not much, but enough to live on if she could get them to market before winter. The problem was the 20-mile drive to the railroad. She couldn't do it alone, and she couldn't afford to hire help. Margaret walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The morning sun painted everything gold. But gold couldn't pay bills, or mend fences, or chase off the wolves that came sniffing around her stock. A hawk circled high above the pasture, riding the wind currents with lazy grace. Free. No responsibilities. No memories to weigh it down. Margaret envied that hawk more than she cared to admit. She turned away from the window and caught her reflection in the mirror by the door. When had she gotten so thin? When had those lines appeared around her eyes? James wouldn't recognize her now. The woman he married had been strong, full of laughter and plans for the future. This woman looked like she was disappearing bit by bit. The clock on the mantel chimed 8 times. Mrs. Anderson would be stopping by soon with fresh bread and more advice about finding a husband. As if Margaret could just order one from the Sears catalog. As if any man would want a broken-down widow with more debts than assets. She picked up James's coffee cup from the table, the one she still set out every morning. It was foolish, but she couldn't seem to stop. His presence lingered in this house like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite die out. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked through the parlor. Everything in this room spoke of James. The rocking chair he made with his own hands. The bookshelf filled with volumes he read aloud to her on winter evenings. The photograph of their wedding day, when they both believed they would grow old together. Margaret picked up the photograph and traced James's face with her finger. He had been so sure about everything back then, so confident they could make a life in this wild place. "We'll build something beautiful here, Maggie," he used to say. "Something that will last long after we're gone." Well, he was gone, and what they built was crumbling like a house made of sand. A knock at the front door made her jump. Too early for Mrs. Anderson. Too early for the bankman. Margaret set down the photograph and smoothed her hair, trying to look like a woman who had her life together. She opened the door to find a stranger standing on her porch, a man with kind eyes and calloused hands, holding his hat like he was in church. His horse waited patiently by the gate, saddlebags bulging with the possessions of someone who traveled light but traveled often. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I'm looking for work. Heard in town you might need help with a cattle drive. Margaret stared at him. She hadn't talked to anyone about a cattle drive, hadn't even decided if she was brave enough to try it. But somehow, this stranger knew exactly what she needed to hear. I'm Daniel McKenna, he continued when she didn't answer. I know my way around cattle, and I work for fair wages. Been traveling a while now, looking for a place to winter over. Winter. The word hit Margaret like a cold wind. Winter meant long nights alone in this house, with nothing but memories for company. Winter meant watching her supplies dwindle while her cattle grew thin. Winter meant making the decision she had been putting off for months. Sell the ranch, or fight to keep it. I can't pay much, she heard herself say, though she hadn't meant to speak at all. Daniel McKenna smiled, and something inside Margaret's chest loosened just a little. When was the last time a man had smiled at her like that? Like she was worth smiling at? Just need a place to stay, and 3 meals a day, ma'am. And maybe some of that coffee I smell brewing. Margaret looked back at the cold stove, then at this stranger who seemed to see more than she was showing. Something about him reminded her of James. Not his looks, but his way of standing. Solid, reliable. Like a man who kept his promises. Coffee's cold, she said. I forgot to light the fire. I make a decent pot myself, if you don't mind the company. Company. When was the last time she had shared a meal with another person? When was the last time someone had offered to help without wanting something in return? Margaret stepped back from the door, her heart beating faster than it had in months. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was inviting trouble, but something told her this man was different from the others who had come sniffing around her property. Maybe, just maybe, he was the answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to pray. Daniel McKenna moved through Margaret's kitchen like he belonged there, his hands sure and steady as he built up the fire in the stove. She watched from the doorway, unsure whether to be grateful or suspicious. Men who showed up out of nowhere usually wanted something more than just work and a place to sleep. You said you heard in town I needed help, Margaret said, settling into her usual chair at the table. Who told you that? Daniel measured coffee into the pot with careful precision. Old-timer at the general store. Henrik, I think his name was. Said you had good stock but might need a hand getting them to market. Henrik, of course. The man noticed everything and kept track of everyone's business like it was his job. But he was also one of the few people who had never suggested she sell the ranch and move to town. Henrik talks too much, Margaret said, but without heat. The smell of fresh coffee was already making the kitchen feel more alive. Sometimes talking too much is just caring too much, Daniel replied. He turned to face her, and she got her first good look at him in proper light. He was older than she had first thought, maybe 45. With silver threads running through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were clean but worn, mended in places with small, careful stitches. A man who took care of what he had because he didn't have much. You said you've been traveling, Margaret said. Where from? Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Missouri, originally. Been moving west for the better part of 2 years now. That's a long time to be on the road. Sometimes a man needs to keep moving until he finds where he's supposed to stop. The coffee began to bubble and hiss. Daniel pulled 2 cups from the shelf like he had been doing it for years, then paused with his hand on the second cup. I hope you don't mind me assuming you'd want some too, he said. Margaret almost smiled. I always want some. I just don't always remember to make it hot. He poured coffee into both cups and set one in front of her. The first sip was strong and bitter and perfect. Better than any coffee she had made in months. This is good, she said. My late wife taught me how to make it right. She said life was too short for weak coffee and cold food. Late wife. So, he understood something about loss. That explained the careful way he moved through her space, like he knew what it meant to walk through a house full of ghosts. I'm sorry, Margaret said. Thank you. It's been 3 years now. Time doesn't make it easier exactly, but it makes it different. 3 years. The same amount of time since James died. Margaret looked at Daniel with new eyes, seeing the grief he carried so quietly. No wonder he had looked at her like he understood something the moment she opened the door. What was her name? Margaret asked. Sarah. We had a boy too, Michael. He was 8 when the fever took them both. Margaret's throat tightened. A child. She and James had wanted children, but it never happened. Sometimes she thought that was a blessing now. How did a person survive losing a child? That's a heavy load to carry, she said quietly. It is, but I learned something about grief these past years. It's not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry better. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and listening to the wind rattling the windows. Outside, Margaret's cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun, unaware that their future hung in the balance. Tell me about this cattle drive, Daniel said finally. Margaret set down her cup. There might not be one. I can't decide if I'm brave enough to try it. What's the alternative? Sell the ranch. Move to town. Find work as a seamstress or a cook, I suppose. Is that what you want? The question hit Margaret harder than she expected. When was the last time someone had asked her what she wanted? Not what she should do, or what made sense, or what other people thought was best. Just what she wanted. I want James back, she said before she could stop herself. I want to wake up tomorrow and have him tell me everything will be fine. I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning every single day. Daniel nodded like her answer made perfect sense. But if you can't have that, what do you want instead? Margaret looked out the window at the land she and James had worked so hard to claim. Every acre held a memory. Every fence post marked a dream they had shared. This ranch was more than just property. It was proof that they had existed together, that their love had built something real. I want to keep what we built, she said. I want to prove that a woman can run a ranch just as well as a man. I want to stop being afraid of everything. Then we better start planning this cattle drive. We. Such a small word, but it made all the difference. Margaret hadn't realized how much she missed having someone to share decisions with, someone to say we instead of you or I. The railroad depot is 20 miles south, she said. The cattle will need to be in good condition when they arrive, which means moving them slow and steady. 2 days on the trail, maybe 3 if the weather turns. Daniel pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began writing. His handwriting was neat and careful, like everything else about him. How many head? He asked. 40 beef cattle. I'll keep the dairy cows here for milk and breeding. That's a good-sized herd for 2 people to handle. We'll need to map out the route, find good water and grass for overnight stops. Margaret felt a flutter of something she barely recognized. Hope. For the first time in months, someone was talking about her plans like they might actually work. There's an old trail that follows the creek most of the way, she said. James and I rode it several times, scouting for the future. James had been so excited about that first cattle drive. He had planned every detail, drawn maps, calculated profits down to the penny. They were going to expand the herd, build a bigger barn, maybe even add a second story to the house. Now Margaret was planning the same drive, but everything felt different, smaller, more desperate, like a last chance instead of a new beginning. You're thinking about him, Daniel said gently. Margaret looked up, startled. How did you know? You get a certain look when you remember. I recognize it because I get the same look when I think about Sarah and Michael. Does it ever stop hurting? The sharp edges wear smooth after a while, but the love stays. That's the part worth keeping. Margaret turned the coffee cup in her hands, feeling the warmth seep through the porcelain. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this alone. You're not alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Margaret looked at the stranger who had appeared on her doorstep like an answer to a prayer, and wondered if she dared to believe him. Outside, a meadowlark sang from the fence post, its voice clear and sweet in the morning air. James had always said meadowlarks were good luck. Maybe he was right, after all. The scream of a wounded animal cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Margaret bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, her cattle were bellowing in panic, their voices mixing with something else, something that made her blood run cold. Wolves. She grabbed James's rifle from beside the bed and ran barefoot to the window. In the pale moonlight, she could see dark shapes moving between her cattle like living shadows. Her prize bull, Caesar, stood his ground near the barn, but blood streamed down his flank where teeth had found their mark. Margaret threw on her coat over her nightgown and burst through the front door. The wooden porch was ice cold under her bare feet, but she barely noticed. Those cattle were her future, her only chance at keeping the ranch. Hey, she shouted, raising the rifle. Get away from them. The wolves scattered at the sound of her voice, but she knew they wouldn't go far. They had tasted blood now. They would be back. "Margaret?" Daniel's voice came from the direction of the barn. She hadn't even seen him move, but there he was, standing between her cattle and the tree line where the wolves had disappeared. He held a burning torch in one hand and his own rifle in the other. "How bad is it?" she called, running toward him across the frosted grass. Daniel was already examining Caesar's wounds, his hands gentle but sure. Deep scratches, but nothing that won't heal. "We got here just in time." Margaret knelt beside her bull, running her hands over his massive head. Caesar had been James's pride and joy, the foundation of their breeding program. The thought of losing him to wolves made her stomach twist with rage and fear. "They'll come back," she said. "Not tonight, but tomorrow maybe, or the night after." Daniel stood and looked toward the dark forest. "Pack of 6, from what I could see. Big ones, hungry ones." Margaret felt the weight of another problem settling on her shoulders. As if the cattle drive wasn't risky enough, now she had to worry about wolves picking off her herd before she could get them to market. "We could move the drive up," she said. "Leave tomorrow instead of next week." Daniel shook his head. "Cattle aren't ready. Half of them are still too thin from the summer drought. Rush them to market now, and you'll get half the price they're worth." He was right, but that didn't make the situation any easier. Margaret looked at her cattle, milling nervously in the pale moonlight. 40 head of beef cattle represented every dollar she had invested in this ranch. Lose even a few to wolves, and she might as well pack up and move to town right now. "There might be another way," Daniel said quietly. Something in his voice made Margaret look at him more closely. In the torchlight, his face was thoughtful, almost calculating, like a man working through a complicated problem. "What kind of way?" "I know someone who might help. Someone who owes me a favor." Margaret waited for him to explain, but Daniel just stared into the darkness. She was learning that he was a man who kept his secrets close, sharing only what he thought she needed to know. "Who?" she pressed. "Old friend. Lives about 10 miles north of here. He's got experience with wolves." "What kind of experience?" Daniel turned the torch in his hands, watching the flames dance. "The kind that comes from losing stock to them, and the kind that comes from learning how to fight back." There was something in his voice that made Margaret think he wasn't telling her everything. But the wolves were real, and her cattle were in danger, and she was running out of options. "Can you reach him tomorrow?" "I can try, but it means leaving you alone here for most of the day." The thought scared Margaret more than she wanted to admit. She had grown used to Daniel's presence over the past few weeks, the comfort of knowing someone else was sharing the load. But fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'll manage," she said. Daniel nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's something else. This friend of mine, he's not exactly what you'd call respectable. Some folks around here might not approve of him being on your property." Margaret almost laughed. "Mr. McKenna, I'm a widow woman running a cattle ranch by herself. Most folks around here already think I'm not respectable. What's one more scandal?" But even as she said it, Margaret wondered what she was getting herself into. Daniel had appeared in her life like an answer to prayer, but she still knew almost nothing about his past. What kind of friends did a traveling man make? What kind of favors did they owe each other? The torch flickered in the morning breeze, casting dancing shadows across the barnyard. In a few hours, the sun would rise on another day of decisions and risks, and small acts of survival. Margaret was tired of being afraid, tired of feeling like she was always one step away from losing everything. "Bring your friend," she said. "Whatever it takes to save the cattle." Daniel's smile was small but genuine. "You're braver than you know, Margaret Caldwell." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified most of the time." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs doing anyway." As they walked back toward the house, Margaret found herself thinking about courage and desperation and the thin line between them. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have considered letting a strange man bring his questionable friends to her ranch. But 3 months ago, she had been a different woman, a woman who still believed the world was safe and predictable. Now she was learning that survival required a different kind of wisdom, the kind that knew when to trust and when to take risks, the kind that understood sometimes the most dangerous choice was doing nothing at all. Daniel banked the fire in the torch and set it by the barn door. "Get some sleep if you can. I'll keep watch until morning." Margaret wanted to argue, to insist they take turns. But exhaustion was pulling at her like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. She needed rest if she was going to face them with any wisdom. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. Thank me when we get your cattle to market safe and sound." As Margaret walked back to the house, she could feel Daniel's eyes on her, watchful and protective. It had been so long since anyone had looked out for her, since anyone had stood between her and the things that threatened her world. But even as gratitude warmed her chest, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Daniel McKenna had secrets. His mysterious friend had secrets. And Margaret was about to invite those secrets onto her property, into her life. She could only hope that whatever came with them would be worth the risk. The letter arrived with the morning frost, carried by a young boy on a tired horse who refused to meet Margaret's eyes. She knew before she opened it that the news would be bad. Good news never came by nervous messenger at dawn. Her hands shook as she unfolded the heavy paper, recognizing the bold handwriting immediately. Robert Caldwell, James's older brother. The man who had never approved of his brother's choice to marry a farmer's daughter and move west. "Margaret," the letter began, without even the courtesy of a proper greeting. "It has come to my attention that you are attempting to operate the ranch alone, despite lacking the experience and resources necessary for such an undertaking. As James's closest living relative, I feel obligated to intervene before you destroy everything my brother worked to build." Margaret's vision blurred with anger, but she forced herself to keep reading. "I have recently discovered significant debts that James apparently failed to mention to you before his untimely death. Debts that now fall to his estate, which means to you to satisfy. The sum is considerable, more than the ranch could possibly be worth in its current condition." The letter went on to detail supposed loans, unpaid bills, and legal obligations. Numbers that made Margaret's stomach drop toward her boots. If even half of what Robert claimed was true, she was ruined. However, the letter continued, "I am prepared to be generous. Sign over the deed to the ranch, and I will assume responsibility for these debts. You will be free to start fresh somewhere more suitable for a woman in your position. I will arrive within the week to finalize the arrangements." Margaret read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Robert Caldwell was coming here, to her ranch, to take everything she and James had built together. "Margaret?" Daniel's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He must have seen her face, because his expression immediately shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" She handed him the letter without speaking. Her throat felt too tight for words. Daniel read quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes that had gone hard as winter ice. "These debts," he said. "Did James ever mention them to you?" Margaret shook her head. "Never. He told me everything about the ranch finances. We went over the books together every month. There were no secret debts. Then there lies. But what if they're not? What if James was trying to protect me from worry?" Margaret's voice cracked. "What if I really do owe all this money?" Daniel set the letter on the table and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, steady against her trembling fingers. "Listen to me, Margaret. I've known men like Robert Caldwell before. Men who see a woman alone and think she's easy prey. Men who use family connections to justify theft. But the law is whatever a man with money and influence says it is, especially when it comes to women's property. But that doesn't mean we have to roll over and let him take what's yours. Yours. Not yours and James's, just yours." Such a small distinction, but it made something shift inside Margaret's chest. This ranch had become hers through grief and hard work and daily choice. She had earned the right to call it home. "What can we do?" she asked. "First, we check those claims. Every debt he lists, every supposed creditor. If James really owed money, there will be records, bills, contracts, paper trails." Margaret nodded, feeling steadier now that they had a plan. "The bank will have records of any loans, and Mr. Peterson at the general store keeps detailed accounts." "Good. And second, we get you some legal advice. There's a lawyer in the county seat who has a reputation for being honest. More importantly, he's not afraid of men like Robert Caldwell." "I can't afford a lawyer." "You can't afford not to have one." Daniel was right, but the thought of spending money she didn't have on a fight she might not win made Margaret's chest tight with panic. Every dollar mattered now. Every cent could mean the difference between keeping the ranch and losing everything. "There's something else," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "My friend, the one I mentioned yesterday, he might be able to help with more than just the wolf problem." Margaret looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "Robert Caldwell is coming here, expecting to find a helpless widow who will sign whatever papers he puts in front of her. It might be useful if he found something different instead." "Like what?" "Like a woman who has friends, allies, people willing to stand with her when trouble comes calling." There was something in Daniel's tone that made Margaret think he was talking about more than just moral support. Something that made her remember his comment about his friend not being entirely respectable. "Daniel, I need to know what kind of man we're talking about. What kind of help he might offer." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the pasture, where her cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old regret. "His name is Thomas Crowfeather. He's half Lakota, half Irish. Fought in the Indian Wars on both sides, depending on which way the wind was blowing. These days he lives alone in the hills, trapping and hunting, staying out of everyone's way." "And the favor he owes you?" "I saved his life once. Or maybe he saved mine. Depends on how you look at it." Daniel turned back to her, his eyes serious. "He's a hard man, Margaret. Not cruel, but hard. He's seen too much violence, done too much killing. Some folks would say he's dangerous." "What do you say?" "I say he's loyal to his friends and merciless to his enemies. And right now, that might be exactly what you need." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows. She was a farmer's daughter who had married a gentle rancher and lived a quiet life. The kind of woman who settled disputes with words and compromise and appeals to reason. But reason wasn't going to work with Robert Caldwell. He was coming here with money and lawyers and the arrogant certainty that he could take whatever he wanted from a woman alone. Maybe it was time to show him how wrong he was. "Send word to your friend," Margaret said. "Tell him I could use his help." Daniel nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Once we go down this path, there's no going back. Thomas isn't the kind of man you can dismiss once you've invited him into your troubles." "I understand." But even as she said it, Margaret wondered if she really did understand what she was agreeing to. She was about to bring violence into her peaceful world, to align herself with dangerous men in a fight that could destroy everything she was trying to save. The alternative, though, was surrender. And surrender meant losing not just the ranch, but the last connection she had to the woman she used to be. The woman who had stood beside James and built something beautiful out of raw prairie and stubborn hope. That woman was worth fighting for, even if the fight changed her forever. Outside, a hawk circled high above the pasture, riding the wind currents with patient grace, hunting, waiting for the right moment to strike. Margaret understood exactly how it felt. The sound of expensive boots on wooden steps announced Robert Caldwell's arrival like thunder before a storm. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as he climbed onto her porch, with the swagger of a man who already owned everything he saw. Behind him came two other men, one carrying a leather satchel that probably held legal papers, the other wearing a gun on his hip like he knew how to use it. Robert didn't bother to knock. He simply opened her front door and walked into her house like he belonged there. "Margaret," he said, removing his hat with mock politeness, "you're looking well, considering." She had been preparing for this moment for 3 days, ever since Daniel rode out to find Thomas Crowfeather. But now, facing James's brother in her own parlor, Margaret felt every carefully planned word dissolve on her tongue. Robert looked exactly like James, if James had been fed on arrogance instead of kindness. Same dark hair, same strong jaw, same blue eyes. But where James's eyes had been warm with laughter, Robert's were cold as winter creek water. "Robert," she managed, "you could have knocked. I could have. But this is family business, and I'm family. More family than that hired hand you've got living in my brother's house." Heat flashed through Margaret's chest. "Daniel earns his keep, and this is my house now, not James's." Robert's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Your house? Let's discuss that, shall we?" He gestured to the man with the leather satchel, who immediately began spreading papers across her kitchen table. Legal documents covered in official seals and dense paragraphs of text that made Margaret's head spin. "As I mentioned in my letter, Robert continued, settling into James's chair like he had every right to it. My dear brother left behind some significant obligations, debts that now fall to his widow to satisfy. Margaret forced herself to look at the papers, though the words seemed to swim before her eyes, numbers that made her stomach clench, names of creditors she had never heard of, loan agreements dated just months before James died. I never saw any of these before, she said. Of course you didn't. James was trying to protect you from worry, but protection doesn't make the debts disappear. Robert's voice carried false sympathy, like oil poured over broken glass. The total comes to just over $8,000, far more than this little ranch could ever be worth. $8,000. Margaret's knees went weak. She had perhaps $200 in the bank, and most of that was earmarked for winter supplies. However, Robert continued, I'm prepared to be generous. Sign the deed over to me, and I'll assume full responsibility for these obligations. You'll be free to start fresh somewhere more appropriate for a woman in your circumstances. The man with the gun shifted his weight, and Margaret heard the creak of leather. A reminder that this conversation had only one acceptable ending, as far as Robert was concerned. What if I can't pay? She asked, stalling for time. Then the creditors will take the ranch anyway, along with everything else you own. Your cattle, your personal belongings, even the clothes on your back if they choose. Bankruptcy is an ugly business, Margaret, especially for women. Margaret's mind raced. Daniel had ridden to the county seat yesterday to check Robert's claims with the bank and the local businesses. He should have been back by now. Where was he? I need time to think about this, she said. Robert's expression hardened. There's nothing to think about. These debts are real and they're due. Sign the papers now or face the consequences later. The consequences of what? Trying to keep my home? The consequences of being a stubborn woman who doesn't know her place. The words hit Margaret like a slap. She saw James and Robert's face, but heard her father's voice from years ago. Women don't run businesses, Margaret. Women don't make important decisions. Women know their place and stay in it. Well, she had tried knowing her place. She had tried being quiet and grateful and proper. And where had it gotten her? Standing in her own kitchen while men tried to steal everything she had worked for. My place, she said slowly, is right here, on my land, in my house. Robert's mask of false politeness finally slipped. Your land? Your house? You contributed nothing to building this ranch. You were just James's wife, a pretty decoration he kept around for company. Without him, you're nothing. The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Margaret felt something break open inside her chest, not her heart, but something harder. Something that had been building pressure for 3 years of grief and doubt and other people's pity. I was James's partner, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I worked beside him every day. I helped build every fence, plant every crop, birth every calf. This ranch exists because of both of us, not just him. Partnership, Robert sneered. Is that what you call it when a man lets his wife play at being useful? I call it marriage, but I suppose you wouldn't understand that, since you've never managed to keep a wife longer than 2 years. The dig hit home. Robert's face flushed red, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually strike her. The man with the gun took a step forward, his hand dropping toward his weapon. That's when the kitchen door opened and Daniel walked in. But it wasn't the Daniel that Margaret knew. This man moved with predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room like a wolf, sizing up a pack of sheep. Behind him came another figure, tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who lived by his own rules. Thomas Crowfeather. Margaret had expected someone dangerous, but she hadn't expected someone so completely still. Thomas stood in her doorway like a carved statue, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene. He wore buckskin and denim with a knife on his belt and a rifle in his hands. But it was his presence that filled the room, the sense that violence followed him like a faithful dog. Gentlemen, Daniel said pleasantly, though his smile had no warmth in it. I hope we're not interrupting anything important. Robert's lawyer cleared his throat nervously. The man with the gun had gone very still, like a rabbit that suddenly realizes it's being hunted. This is a private family matter, Robert said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. Family, Thomas repeated, speaking for the first time. His voice was soft, almost gentle. Margaret found that more frightening than if he had shouted. Funny thing about family. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most eager to spill it. Daniel moved to stand beside Margaret, his presence warm and solid. We've had an interesting day in town, Margaret. Turns out none of these debts exist. The bank never made these loans. The merchants never extended this credit. Amazing how creative a man can be with paper and ink. Margaret felt a rush of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. They're forgeries? Every single one. Though I have to admire the craftsmanship. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make them look official. Robert's face went white, then red, then white again. You're lying. Am I? Daniel pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This is a statement from the bank president, confirming that James Caldwell died with no outstanding debts. This is a letter from the county clerk, stating that all property taxes are current. This is an affidavit from 3 local merchants, swearing that James never owed them money. He laid each document on the table with deliberate care, covering Robert's forged papers, like snow covering mud. So the question becomes, Daniel continued, what do we do with a man who tries to steal a widow's property through fraud? Thomas shifted slightly, and Margaret heard the soft click of metal on metal. He had cocked his rifle, without seeming to move. We could call the sheriff, Thomas said thoughtfully. Though he's a busy man, might take him a while to get out here. Lot can happen while we're waiting. The man with the gun made the mistake of reaching for his weapon. He never cleared leather. Thomas moved like lightning, the butt of his rifle connecting with the man's wrist in a blur of motion. The gun clattered to the floor, followed by a howl of pain. I wouldn't, Thomas said mildly, as if he were commenting on the weather. Robert's lawyer was already backing toward the door, his face pale as milk. I was just hired to deliver papers I don't know anything about any irregularities. Then you should probably leave, Daniel suggested, before you learn something you'd rather not know. The lawyer fled, leaving his satchel behind. The man with the broken wrist followed, cradling his injured arm and muttering curses under his breath. That left Robert alone in Margaret's kitchen, facing 3 people who had no reason to show him mercy. This isn't over, he said, but his voice shook with rage and fear. I'll be back, with the real law next time. You do that, Margaret said. She was surprised by how calm she sounded, how steady her voice had become. But when you come back, make sure your papers are real, because next time, I might not be feeling so generous. Robert stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Margaret stared back, no longer the grieving widow who had opened her door to his false sympathy. She was something else now, something harder, something that wouldn't be moved. The silence after Robert's departure felt like the moment after lightning strikes, when the world holds its breath waiting for thunder. Margaret stood in her kitchen, surrounded by scattered legal papers, some real, some false, and tried to process what had just happened. She had won. Against all odds, against men with money and lawyers and threats of violence, she had won. You did good, Margaret, Daniel said quietly. Standing up to him like that took real courage. But Margaret barely heard him. She was looking at Thomas Crowfeather, who stood by her window watching Robert's retreating wagon, with the patient attention of a hunter tracking wounded prey. He'll be back, Thomas said without turning around. Men like that don't give up easy. Let him come, Margaret replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Next time I'll be ready. Thomas turned to study her with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her bones. After a long moment, he nodded once, a gesture that felt like acceptance, maybe even respect. You might be at that, he said. Daniel began collecting the forged papers from the table. We should burn these. No point leaving evidence of his fraud lying around. Wait, Margaret said. I want to read them first. I want to understand exactly what he was trying to do. She picked up one of the fake loan documents, studying the careful forgery. Robert had been thorough. She had to give him that. He had created an entire fictional history of James's supposed debts, complete with signatures and official-looking seals. How did you know they were fake? She asked Daniel. The dates were wrong. One of these loans was supposedly made 2 months after James died. Another was signed on a day when James was laid up with a broken leg, I remember, because you wrote to me about it. Margaret looked at him sharply. I wrote to you? Daniel went still, realizing his mistake. I meant, that is, you knew James before you came here. It wasn't a question. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might collapse under too much weight. Thomas watched from the window, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Daniel said finally. "I knew him." "How?" Daniel sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "We served together in the army, years ago. Before he married you. Before he came west. We kept in touch through letters." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. "You've been writing to my husband for years, and I never knew?" It wasn't a secret, exactly. Just men's business. Army stories. Talk about cattle and whether the railroad would ever reach this far west. Men's business. Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. "And did this men's business include discussions about his wife?" Daniel's face flushed. "He mentioned you, of course. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever met. Said this ranch wouldn't exist without your hard work and smart thinking." "What else did he say?" "That if anything ever happened to him, he worried about you being alone out here. That Robert had always resented James for leaving Boston, for choosing a different kind of life. That Robert might try to take advantage if James wasn't around to protect you." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "James asked you to watch out for me." Not in so many words, but yes. In his last letter, before he died, he said he was worried about the future. Said he wished he had a friend nearby who could help if you needed it. Margaret stared at Daniel, seeing him with completely different eyes. The helpful stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment. The skilled ranch hand who knew exactly what she needed to hear. The gentleman who had seemed to understand her grief so perfectly. "So this has all been duty," she said. "An obligation to a dead friend." "No." Daniel's voice was fierce. "It started that way, maybe. But what I feel for you now, that's real, Margaret. That has nothing to do with James, or promises or duty. How can I believe that? How can I trust anything you've told me?" Thomas cleared his throat from the window. "Might want to save the personal business for later. We've got company coming." Margaret looked past him to see a line of riders approaching the ranch. Her neighbors Henrik from the next spread over, the Anderson family, young Billy from the general store, even old Mrs. Patterson, who rarely left her house. "I sent word around while I was in town," Daniel said. "Told folks that Robert Caldwell was coming to make trouble for you. Asked if they might want to be here when he arrived." Margaret watched her neighbors dismount in her yard, their faces serious but determined. Henrik carried a shotgun. Mr. Anderson had his hunting rifle. Even Mrs. Patterson held a rolling pin like a weapon. "They came," she whispered. "Of course they came," Henrik called out, apparently having heard her through the open window. "You think we'd let some city snake steal our neighbor's land?" Mrs. Anderson stepped onto the porch, her usually stern face softened with something that might have been affection. "Margaret Caldwell, you've been grieving so hard you forgot you weren't alone. But we've been watching. We've been waiting for you to remember that you're part of this community." "Part of it?" Billy grinned, his young face bright with excitement. "Heck, Mrs. Caldwell, you practically are this community. Who do you think we call when someone's sick? Who brings food when there's a new baby or a death in the family? Who organized the school fund and the church repairs?" Margaret stared at them, overwhelmed. She had been so focused on her isolation, her grief, her sense of being alone against the world, that she had forgotten about the small acts of connection that had continued even after James died. "We should have done more," Mrs. Anderson said quietly. "Should have made it clearer that you belonged here, with or without a husband. That's on us. The ranch is yours," Henrik added firmly. "Legally, morally, and practically. Anyone who says different will have to go through all of us." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the full weight of community support, of belonging to something larger than her own grief. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Mrs. Patterson advised. "Just remember it next time you start thinking you have to face trouble alone." The neighbors began to disperse, satisfied that the immediate crisis had passed. But their message was clear. Margaret Caldwell was not just tolerated in this community. She was valued, protected, loved. As the last wagon disappeared down the road, Margaret found herself alone with Daniel and Thomas. The afternoon sun slanted through her kitchen windows, warming the room and making the scattered papers glow like fallen leaves. "I'm still angry with you," she told Daniel. "About the letters. About not telling me the truth from the beginning. I know, I should have been honest, but I understand why you did it. And I believe you when you say your feelings changed. Daniel looked up hopefully. You do? A man fulfilling an obligation wouldn't have stayed to fight wolves, wouldn't have risked his life standing up to Robert, wouldn't have looked at me the way you do when you think I'm not watching. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. You've been watching me watch you? I've been watching everything, Margaret replied, learning to see past my own grief, learning to trust again. Thomas shouldered his rifle and moved toward the door. Sounds like my work here is done. Where will you go? Margaret asked. Back to the hills. Back to being alone. It's what I do best. You could stay, she said impulsively. Help with the ranch. There's always work for a man with your skills. Thomas paused in the doorway, his weathered face thoughtful. That's kind of you, Mrs. Caldwell, but you don't need men like me around when you're trying to build something peaceful. I'm better at ending things than beginning them. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect. But if you ever need the kind of help that Daniel can't provide, you know where to find me. After he left, Margaret and Daniel stood in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the debris of crisis and the promise of new beginnings. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Margaret looked around her kitchen in her house, on her land, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Something that felt like home, like belonging, like the first deep breath after a long illness. Now we get ready for winter, she said. We plan that cattle drive for spring. We build something worth keeping. Together? Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt like the expression belonged on her face. Together. The delicate china teapot sat between them on the kitchen table like a bridge spanning two broken hearts. Margaret traced its painted wildflowers with trembling fingers, unable to believe that Daniel had chosen something so beautiful, so perfectly suited to replace all the broken pieces in her life. I saw it in the window at Henderson's store 3 weeks ago, Daniel said softly. The moment I looked at it, I thought of you. Not the sad woman who's been drinking cold coffee from chipped cups, but the woman James wrote about in his letters. The one who planted wildflowers around the house just because they made her smile. Margaret's breath caught. She had forgotten about those flowers, forgotten that she used to care about beauty for its own sake. The wildflower garden had died the winter after James passed, and she had never replanted it. I stopped seeing beauty in things, she admitted. Everything just became about surviving another day. I know that feeling. Daniel's voice carried the weight of his own losses. After Sarah and Michael died, I spent 2 years seeing the world in gray. No color, no joy, just empty space where happiness used to live. The late November wind rattled the windows, but inside the kitchen felt warm and safe. Margaret poured water from the kettle into the new teapot, watching the steam rise between them like incense in a church. What changed? She asked. What brought the color back? Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he had heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, like a man walking across thin ice. Meeting, you changed it. Not just seeing you, but watching you fight. Watching you refuse to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. You reminded me that strength isn't about not falling down. It's about getting back up every time you do. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. No one had ever spoken about her that way before, like she was someone worth admiring instead of someone to be pitied. I don't feel strong most of the time, she said. I feel scared and tired and angry at the world for taking James away from me. Being strong doesn't mean you don't feel those things. It means you feel them and keep going anyway. The tea had finished steeping. Margaret poured it into 2 cups, marveling at how different it felt to use beautiful things instead of just practical ones. The warmth spread through her hands and up her arms, thawing places that had been frozen for years. Daniel, she said carefully, what we have between us, it's not the same as what James and I had. Something flickered across his face. I know. Does that bother you? Margaret considered the question seriously. Her love for James had been the passionate fire of youth, all-consuming and bright and certain. What she felt for Daniel was different, deeper maybe, built on shared understanding and mutual respect rather than just attraction and hope. No, she said finally, it doesn't bother me. James and I loved each other like children love with our whole hearts, but without really knowing what we were choosing. You and I, We know what loss feels like. We know how precious it is to find someone worth caring about. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, familiar now after weeks of working together. Margaret, I need you to know something. What I feel for you isn't about replacing what you lost or trying to be James. It's about discovering who we might become together. The words settled around Margaret's heart like a warm blanket. She had been so afraid that loving someone new would mean betraying James's memory, dishonoring what they had built together. But Daniel was offering something different. Not a replacement, but a new chapter. I never thought I would love again, she said quietly. After James died, I was sure that part of my life was over, that I would just exist until it was my turn to join him. And now? Margaret looked into Daniel's eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the future she had planned with James, but a different one. Maybe better in some ways. Certainly more aware of how fragile happiness could be. Now I think maybe the heart can hold more than one great love. Maybe losing someone doesn't have to mean closing yourself off to everyone else. Daniel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Some flowers bloom twice, he said. Different than the first time, maybe, but just as beautiful. The phrase hit Margaret like lightning. James used to say almost the exact same thing about the prairie roses that bloomed twice each summer, once in early June, then again in late August if the weather was right. James told you that, she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. In one of his letters, he was writing about you, actually, about how you had bloomed as a young bride, then bloomed again differently as a rancher's wife. He said you kept surprising him with new kinds of strength. Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were tears of recognition, of coming home to herself after a long journey through darkness. He would have liked you, she said. I hope so. I would have liked him too. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking tea from the beautiful pot, and watching the afternoon light fade toward evening. Outside, Margaret's cattle moved slowly toward the barn, following patterns established over years of shared routine. There's something else I need to tell you, Daniel said eventually. Margaret's stomach tightened. After all the revelations of the past few days, she wasn't sure she was ready for more surprises. I've been thinking about the spring cattle drive, he continued, about what comes after we get your stock to market. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want to just winter here and move on when the weather breaks. I want to stay, Margaret. I want to help you build this ranch into something even bigger than what you and James dreamed. The words hung between them like a marriage proposal, which Margaret supposed they were, in a way, not just an offer of love, but an offer of partnership, of building a life together based on work and respect and shared dreams. What exactly are you asking me? She said. Daniel took a deep breath. I'm asking if you would consider marrying me. Not because you need taking care of, but because I think we could take care of each other. I'm asking if you would let me help you prove that a woman can run a ranch just as well as any man, and that sometimes two people together can do things neither could manage alone. Margaret's heart raced. Marriage. She had thought that word was buried with James, that she would never speak it again in relation to herself. But looking at Daniel now, seeing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, she realized that marriage didn't have to mean the same thing twice. Her marriage to James had been about young love and shared dreams and the excitement of building something from nothing. Marriage to Daniel would be about mature love and hard-earned wisdom, and the courage to risk happiness again after loss. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how easily the word came. Yes, I'll marry you. Daniel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He stood and came around the table, pulling Margaret to her feet and into his arms. We'll do it right, he said. Have the neighbors over. Make it a real celebration. Show everyone that Margaret Caldwell McKenna is here to stay. Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Margaret Caldwell McKenna. I like the sound of that. As Daniel kissed her, Margaret caught sight of James's photograph on the mantel. For a moment, she felt a flicker of guilt, a sense that she was somehow betraying his memory. But then she remembered his letters to Daniel, his concern for her future, his hope that she would find happiness even after he was gone. James had loved her enough to want her to keep living, keep loving, keep blooming. Some flowers bloom twice. And sometimes, Margaret thought, the second blooming was even more beautiful because it came after the long winter. Spring arrived early in the Dakota Territory that year, and Margaret McKenna stood at her kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the world in shades of gold and green. The coffee in her china cup was hot and strong, and the sound of her husband's voice drifting in from the barn made her smile in ways she had forgotten were possible. Husband. Even 6 months after their February wedding, the word still felt new in her mouth, different from when she had been James's wife, but no less precious. The wildflower garden beside the house was already showing green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Margaret had replanted it in March, working alongside Daniel to prepare the beds and scatter seeds. This time, she had chosen different flowers, prairie roses, an Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans that would bloom twice if the weather was kind. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret opened it to find a young woman standing on her porch, holding a baby in her arms and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. McKenna?" the woman said hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I heard, that is, people said you might be able to help me." Margaret recognized her now, Emma Carson, barely 18, whose husband had died in a logging accident just before Christmas. The girl looked thin and tired, with the hollow-eyed desperation of someone running out of options. "Come in," Margaret said immediately, stepping aside to let Emma enter. "You look like you could use some coffee and breakfast." Emma's eyes filled with tears at the kindness. "I don't want to be a burden, I don't know what else to do." Margaret guided the girl to a chair and automatically began preparing food. It was something she had learned from her own mother, that crisis was best faced on a full stomach. "Tell me what's wrong," she said gently. "My husband's brother wants to take the farm," Emma said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Says a woman can't run it alone, especially with a baby. Says Tom would have wanted him to have it, to keep it in the family name." Margaret's hands stilled on the coffee pot. The story was painfully familiar, though Emma's situation was even more precarious than hers had been. At least Margaret had owned her ranch outright. Emma was fighting for property that legally belonged to her dead husband's family. "What does the law say?" Margaret asked. "That I can stay until the baby is grown, but that William, that's Tom's brother, can take over managing the property. He's already moved into the main house. Says I can live in the old cabin by the creek if I want to stay." The cabin by the creek. Margaret had seen it once, a one-room shack with a leaking roof and a floor that flooded every spring. No place to raise a child. "Emma," Margaret said carefully, "what is it you want to do?" The girl looked up with eyes that were older than her years. "I want to keep my farm. I want to raise my son on the land his father worked. I want to prove that I'm more than just a burden to be managed." The fierce determination in Emma's voice reminded Margaret of herself a year ago, standing in this same kitchen while Robert Caldwell tried to steal her future. But Emma was even younger, with even fewer resources and no helpful neighbors to rally to her cause. "It won't be easy," Margaret said. "Men like William Carson don't give up without a fight." "I know, but I have to try. For Tommy." Emma looked down at her sleeping baby. "I can't let him grow up thinking his mother was too weak to fight for what was his." Daniel's boots sounded on the porch, and he appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He took in the scene quickly, the young woman with her baby, Margaret's protective posture, the tension in the air that spoke of trouble. "Ladies," he said politely, "I hope I'm not interrupting. Daniel, this is Emma Carson. She needs our help." Margaret quickly explained the situation while Daniel listened with the focused attention he gave to all problems that mattered to people he cared about. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "William Carson," he said finally. "Big man with red hair and a temper to match?" Emma nodded. "You know him?" "I know his reputation. He's not well liked in town, but he has money and connections. That makes him dangerous to cross." "More dangerous than Robert Caldwell was?" Margaret asked. Daniel considered this. Different kind of dangerous. Robert was all bluster and legal tricks. William Carson is the kind of man who might use his fists if he doesn't get his way. Emma's face went pale. "You think he would hurt me?" "I think he would do whatever he thought he could get away with," Daniel said honestly. "But that doesn't mean you should give up. It just means you need to be smart about how you fight." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, the same fierce protectiveness she had felt when Robert threatened her ranch, but stronger now. Emma was young and alone and facing the same battle Margaret had fought. The difference was that Margaret now had the resources to help. "Emma," she said, "what if you didn't have to fight alone?" The girl looked up hopefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are women in this territory who have faced similar battles. Women who have learned how to stand up to men who think they can take whatever they want. Maybe it's time we started standing together." Daniel smiled, recognizing the tone in Margaret's voice. It was the same tone she had used when facing down Robert Caldwell. The same tone that meant she had made up her mind and wouldn't be moved. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking Emma should stay here while we figure this out. I'm thinking we should visit some of our neighbors, particularly the women neighbors. I'm thinking it's time to show William Carson that Emma isn't as alone as he thinks she is." Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "You would do that for me? You barely know me." "I know enough," Margaret said firmly. "I know what it feels like to be told you're not strong enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough to keep what's yours by right. I know what it's like to face men who think women are property to be managed, instead of people with their own dreams and desires." She moved to the window and looked out at the land she had fought so hard to keep. Her cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun, fat and healthy after a good winter. The fence posts stood straight and strong, mended and reinforced through months of hard work. The house itself seemed to glow with contentment, filled with the warmth of people who belong there. "This ranch exists because James and I built it together," she continued. "It survives because I refused to let other people's expectations define what I could accomplish. And it will thrive because Daniel and I are building something even stronger on the foundation James and I laid." She turned back to Emma, her eyes bright with purpose. "Some flowers bloom twice, Emma. Sometimes the second blooming is more beautiful than the first because it comes after surviving the winter. Your battle isn't over. It's just beginning." Emma straightened in her chair, holding her baby a little tighter. "What do I need to do?" Margaret smiled, feeling the same fierce joy she had felt when her neighbors rallied to support her against Robert. "First, you need to finish your breakfast. Then we're going to pay some visits. It's time the women of this territory reminded men like William Carson that we're not as powerless as they think we are." Daniel chuckled and shook his head. "I almost feel sorry for William Carson. He has no idea what he's up against." "Good," Margaret said. "Let's keep it that way until it's too late for him to do anything about it." As the three of them sat around the table making plans, Margaret caught sight of James's photograph on the mantel. For a moment, she could almost hear his voice, warm with pride and approval. "Some flowers bloom twice, Maggie. And some women are strong enough to help other flowers bloom too." Outside, the meadowlarks sang their morning songs, and the Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under a sky full of promise. Margaret McKenna sipped her coffee from her beautiful china cup and smiled, knowing that she had finally found her true calling. She wasn't just a rancher anymore. She was a woman who helped other women discover their own strength, and that, she thought, was the most beautiful kind of blooming of all.